Hi, it's Joe Mullings from 160 Studios in Delray Beach, and I'm excited because this is a special event. I've got some members of MDIC here, and joining me today are Chip Hans, and Chip is a 30-year vet of the medical device industry and diagnostics. He's a board member at MDIC, and he champions in particular the EFS program. Chip comes with a pretty substantial resume. Previous president of Abbott Cardiovascular Division, CEO of Creganna, currently with Regatta Medical, which is his firm, and he was an entrepreneur in residence with the FDA. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And also with me in studio today is Rick Jeffreyon. Rick is also a 35-year vet of the medical device industry, 25 years in cardiovascular. He's been a serial entrepreneur, bringing some pretty well-known products to the U.S. over the years. And he also is on the executive committee and the board of directors of MDIC. Rick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's good to be here. So Chip, the EFS program, it's something that I know a number of people are familiar with, but even surprisingly more so, there are people who need to know about it. And what is the history and the need and the growth of the EFS program in the U.S.?
Right. It's a fascinating story. Early feasibility studies began in the U.S. in 2013 with the FDA guidance document. And you got to step back and ask yourself, why was that a watershed moment? And in 2011 was when the Edwards Sapien heart valve, a clearly life-saving device, was approved in the U.S. more than 4 years after the CE mark approval of the product in the U.S. and the CE mark product and approval in Europe, and then more than 10 years after first-in-man clinical research. And I think when this life-saving product became available, a lot of people, industry, FDA, Congress, the entire ecosystem looked at it and said, why do we have to wait 4 years after Europe to get products approved that are so important and meaningful to U.S. patients? And after a lot of consideration, a lot of topics were taken up, and I think the FDA really championed some new thoughts in that area. They realized at FDA that just changing the review cycle, which is 180 to 270 days, isn't going to really change a 4-year gap in approval. And they have to go look back earlier than that at the clinical trial processes that take so long to do in the US. So one of the issues was found that it takes more than a year, or has taken us more than a year, to simply negotiate a pivotal clinical trial with the FDA. So the FDA's data in 2011 showed more than 400 days to negotiate with a sponsor a study. And over the next 4 years, by 2015, through process improvement within the FDA, they'd reduced that to 30 days. So that takes a year out of the cycle for new product innovation. And they also looked at the early clinical research that was being done, and it was all being done in Europe. It had become so difficult to negotiate with the FDA an early feasibility study that people had gone elsewhere to conduct that first-in-man research. So the FDA overhauled that process, announced it in 2013, and that became the starting point for early feasibility study research in the U.S. And very meaningful improvement, as we'll talk about today.
Yeah, and when you take a year out of the equation in a startup, and that burn can be anywhere from, gosh, a couple $100,000 to $1 million a month, that's substantial. And Rick, when the EFS program was kicked off, you were CEO of a startup company that was developing a very complex
That's
technology.
right. It was a Class 3 device, a PMA device.
Yep. And what was the environment like previous to the EFS program, and then afterwards? Because you experienced it on both sides.
Sure, absolutely. Well, before 2013, before the initiation of the EFS program, if you had an early stage medical technology, Essentially what you would do is you'd first of all, you're first in human absolutely outside the United States. And then you'd transition that to a CE mark study to get approval in Europe to commercialize your device. You'd perform your CE mark study over in Europe, which of course that makes sense. You're enrolling patients in Europe to get commercialization in Europe. But the thing is, it wasn't until you actually finished your CE mark study that you would then take that data, and that would be the data that in many cases you would use to go back to the FDA to initiate the pathway to approval in the United States. And even in some cases, you would actually even do a small feasibility in the US before you'd go to pivotal, even though you had just completed a full commercialization trial over in Europe. So as a result, this is, as Chip had mentioned, this is another reason why patients were waiting 4 years or even longer to gain access to the same devices that were actually available and patients could get access to in Europe and in other geographies. And that's despite the fact that most of these devices were actually invented in the United States and were being funded, by investors based in the United States. Not in all cases, but in most. So it really was there was a real human cost associated with it. From a company perspective, it was a real challenge too, because what you're doing is if you're an early stage company, you may have 30, 40 employees, and you're shipping your entire clinical team across the ocean. They may have to hang out in Europe for a couple weeks if you're performing studies there and go back and forth and all the jet lag and all the time zone changes and all those things. You can imagine the inefficiencies that introduces into the whole development process. So that was also a significant cost. And I think that if the environment had continued, and we were already starting to see that in the 2013 timeframe, if the environment continued, I think the United States would really begin essentially exporting companies. Ideas may still be generated, but the companies would eventually be exported outside the United States. So the FDA really took notice.
So when you look at the dynamics of that and you really unwind them, I've been involved with hundreds of startups. People have to understand that when an investor's looking at a startup, that investor's saying, okay, how do I get 4, maybe 6x return? And so when I start to add up sending clinical teams overseas, when I start adding up the expenses on the travel, the entertainment, the delay, I still have to carry the burn here in the States for my team, and I've got to keep them employed. I can't furlough them.
That's right.
Right? I can't let them go and then bring them back when it's a better time because of the tribal knowledge.
Correct.
So now an investor comes in, and you are looking at a substantial difference in the next round you need to take you through that pathway, which then in turn has the investor go, wait a minute, I've got to exit this for an extra $120 million now because of this delay.
So remember what Chip said, like the sapien valve, for example, from the time it hit first in man to the time it was approved in the United States, pre-2013, not now, but pre-2013, 10 years. So if you're a startup and you think there's no way you can even consider getting to commercialization with the device, and VCs work on 10-year funds, and they may be investing in you in year 2, 3, or what have you. They want to return 5 years down the road, or maybe even 2 or 3 years down the road, but at least within 5. And if you're not able to show that with some sort of a pathway, and if you don't have that opportunity because the regulatory pathway is obviously showing to be much longer, it may be difficult to get funded at all.
Yeah. So what did it mean to your company in particular? Let's take it real life. So you had that company. It was a structural heart on the tricuspid mitral play, right?
Right.
What did it mean to your company?
It was big because in the 2013 timeframe when EFS was initiated, and then it started to emerge over 14, 15, et cetera, it was a situation where actually what was happening was things were liberalizing. Therefore, in the U.S., you could bring an early stage technology to the U.S. for early stage clinical investigation. But at the same time, Europe was shutting down. So Europe had in France, there was a breast implant scandal, and as a result, the regulations started changing, and the regulatory authorities in Europe started getting very conservative. And so all this early stage clinical research that was happening in Europe all of a sudden was shutting down. Fortunately, we had EFS coming in. If a company like mine did not have the opportunity to take advantage of an EFS program, we may have ceased to exist. And I think there are many companies would have been in that same situation.
Chip, from your side, you've headed up, as we mentioned earlier, very large organizations, Abbott's Cardiovascular Division, Creganna. an outsider on this could say, okay, how are you cutting that time down? Are you cutting corners? Are you sacrificing safety? When you speed something up, something's got to give. How would we answer that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's really about process improvement. And I think many of us have been involved with the process improvement initiatives. We realize that there's so many non-value added activities that take up the time. And the FDA was very thoughtful in creating EFS, that they would make the risk mitigation strategies be more robust. So clinical oversight, clinician oversight, pre-study initiation, training regimens, safety oversight, reporting to FDA after just a few patients have begun. All these are simple risk mitigation strategies that really hadn't been in place before. And the FDA had been treating feasibility research the same as a PMA pivotal clinical, and had one size fits all for its IDE review cycle. So enabling a more robust risk mitigation strategy made it more appropriate for the type of research that was being done. And then still the PMA approval that is required is still under the same standards that the FDA has always had. So all this was just taking out the slack that was in the system, adding risk mitigation procedures, and allowing research to be conducted for US patients, but under US clinical regimens, with US clinicians, with US type style follow-up, and US high quality reporting, all of which I think the agency was much more satisfied they were getting quality clinical data coming out of feasibility research versus, Eastern Europe or, some other locations, all of which provide good data, but not necessarily of US demographics, US clinical regimens that are probably more relevant for US patients.
Yeah, when you look at the life of a startup company, there's that saying, I'm not agreeing with it, is let's fail really fast. It allows me to fail really fast on the front side of the clinical curve.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and I know Rick has had that experience, but
Yeah.
If you get a study up and going and then you have to wait a year to find out whether the product works, you certainly haven't failed fast.
That's right.
You failed slow, and all the burn rate in between.
And that's one of the great aspects, too, of the EFS design, is that in the middle of an EFS study, usually you start, it's only like 10, 15 patients. But in the middle of that study, if you run 3 patients and say, it's just not working out like you thought, and maybe you need to make an engineering change, you can do that. In part, in the old days, it was like you had to wait to get your CE mark finished, and the reason was that you wanted to show the data to the FDA, but also your design was frozen at that point, at least that first generation, right? But with an EFS now, you can get in at very early stage in the United States, run through 3 patients. Hopefully it goes really well, but what if it doesn't and you need to make an adjustment? You can do that, pause the study, and then reinitiate the study, when you've made that change.
And those are the elements in that EFS program?
Exactly. Typically, 10 to 15 patients, although once you have 10 to 15 patients in, assuming it goes really well, and assuming you have good safety, and you're seeing some early signals, trends on efficacy, obviously you're underpowered to show any kind of real efficacy, you can get extensions. So you can get so in our company, we had 10 to 15, we did our first 15 patients. I think it was after the first 12, and they went well, we actually reapplied for an extension. And by the time we had enrolled patient 15, we already had another extension to do 15 more. And then we did 15 more. So you can continue to do that, assuming things are running well. And you can run that right and dovetail that right into a pivotal trial. So it really does initiate your pathway. And it can be a continuous pathway, to eventual approval in the United States.
Yeah, it would feel like when I had to come over from Europe, and I used to see it with a lot of the companies, is it would almost be like a reset. You lose the inertia when you were overdoing your clinical work in Europe, and it would be like, okay, here we go. And it's like everything had to start again.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So you want that continuous opportunity because it's a continuous learning, right? And your team continues on that education. Your physicians continue to be educated and get better, get up the learning curve. You learn about the learning curve. What you don't want is that stop, start, because then you never really have an opportunity to see what the device can do when folks get up the learning curve.
So this is good news for the industry.
It's great news for the industry overall. It really is. It's so important because, again, if the EFS program had never been initiated, where would class 3 companies in particular, right? If you have a PMA, some 510Ks could make it through, but as a PMA device, where would you go? You know, because it's as Chip had mentioned, you know, you need to show a pathway to approval in some of the major markets. Major markets, Europe, major market is the US. There are some other major markets as well, but predominantly, you know, the venture capital community is predicated on when are you going to get approval in Europe? When are you going to get approval in the United States? What does that timeline look like? What are the risks? If you're not able to show that, you're unlikely to get funded. And that's what companies would have faced without EFS. That's why this program is so important.
So Chip, why does the EFS program have to be so efficient?
Well, it's those timelines that we've talked about that can be so long and lengthy to get products to U.S. Patients. But it's interesting, when the program got started in 2013, you know, a review cycle before that had taken as much as a year with the FDA. And then with the creation of this program, that was reduced to 30 to 60 days. So that shaved a big chunk of time out. And I think a lot of the first movers said, terrific, let's go do our clinical research in the United States. And what then happened was people began to realize that the ecosystem for conducting first-in-man type research in the US was really not working very well. So that while we might have solved the FDA issue, IRB reviews within institutions, the contracting, the budgeting, negotiating informed consent with a clinical site, getting prepped and trained and screening patients, all these activities could take as much as a year, as we later on established. So, you know, companies like Rix would get started. Great news, we got FDA approval to run this study, and then they would get bogged down once again in over a year's worth of bureaucratic processes. Have nothing to do with enrolling patients, but just administrative activities that you know, once again slowed the process down.
So that brings in the MDIC organization and the EFS program. What can be done? Because it looks like it falls outside the FDA's guidance. They give the head nod, and it ends up being, yep, let's go. But a year. So where does MDIC and EFS come in there? What can be done?
Yeah, it's a really interesting organization. MDIC is the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. It's a public-private partnership. FDA first conceived of the idea back in the beginning of the decade. So as members of this organization is FDA, industry, CMS, NIH, patient advocacy groups, BARDA, others, more than 50 members, and they work on regulatory science issues. So the ecosystem challenges that lie between us. So a perfect home for working on this, to work collaboratively on this kind of problem. Pamela Goldberg is CEO, and you know, Rick and I are both board members and are active in trying to drive these kinds of initiatives to real meaningful improvements. So we formed a steering committee that involved clinicians, industry, FDA, et cetera, and started to tackle these kinds of ecosystem problems of how to streamline the actual startup of an FDA EFS type study.
So you can drive those efficiencies in an organization, no doubt, but now drive those efficiencies or lack thereof across an ecosystem like healthcare, the medical device industry, the multiple stakeholders, the physicians, the patients.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Yeah.
Six Sigma people want to know.
Yeah, I know. It was very interesting. Exactly. You know, I think the first thought of any efficiency improvement initiative is you have to measure the performance of the system. And there were many anecdotes and many opinions of what was wrong with the system, but no data on how it was actually performing. So MDIC, in its unique position, was able to reach out to industry sponsors, Rick's company being an example, who actually confidentially supplied the data on the timelines involved with actually conducting these various different steps. And we aggregated that and then reported it publicly to everyone, more than 60 different sites, more than a dozen studies that had started up, and got to see the pattern and brought focus to that. So we found out quickly that the FDA process was taking a little more than 60 days. The IRB review process within an institution was taking a little more than 60 days. Contracting, I think, was a big surprise, was taking more than 4 months on average with every institution. So just lawyers going back and forth on negotiating and tweaking language that probably had nothing to do with the study itself, but just a bunch of activity that was hard for the ecosystem to manage. And then the time to the first patient enrollment, the screening, the prep for that was another 6 months on top of that. So all those activities on average for site with the data was over a year, and really a striking problem that kind of woke up everybody in the ecosystem. This is something we have to fix. We got to change this. This is has nothing to do with helping patient care. We've got to solve these kinds of problems.
Mm. And Rick, your company at the time, you experienced all this?
We did. I mean, we fell right within the stats. The FDA has done a great job on EFS and getting just an EFS approved, right? So our EFS was approved in 28 days. Can you imagine? Very fast. Mm-hmm. We had a meeting with them prior, and I would recommend that any company that's going to, contemplate an EFS have a pre-meeting with the FDA. They'll tell you, they'll look at all your data, what you have. Maybe you have a few clinical cases, maybe you don't. Maybe you have a lot of great bench data, whatever you have, they'll look at it. And they'll tell you, either you're ready or you're not. Tell you what you may need to do if you're not. But if you are ready, on average, these are getting approved in the 30-day cycle. The majority are getting approved within a 30-day cycle. So that was true for us. Our first site was up and running. One site was up and running in 3 months' time. We got our first patient in 3 months, very fast. But that was a single site, that was an outlier. Mm. Beyond that, all of the other sites, 6 to 9 months to get to your first patient. That's significant. You're burning money all the while. And the biggest issue, and it's what Chip had mentioned, really was contracts. And as a small company, quite frankly, we're willing to give on a lot of language that the big companies, unfortunately, are not able to give on. So we could be quite flexible. So it wasn't like we were playing hard on negotiations. It really was, we're just a small company, and we didn't have the ability to get the legal teams in the institutions to actually just put it on their desk and spend time on it. So there was no commitment from the institution to get an EFS up and running quickly. Remember, EFS, 10, 15 patients. So maybe that site's only going to do 2, 3 patients. So they didn't really therefore make it a priority. For the larger companies, the language becomes an issue. That tends to be more the gating item.
Sure, and the larger company can endure that burden a lot more, obviously,
right,
with resources on patient recruiting,
That's
on
right,
timelines, and some leverage.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But that being said, the fact that the language was an issue and a big gating item for many folks, what had happened, we figured out there were 2 things that needed to be done, 2 main things, and that is we needed to have a group of institutions that just committed to a fixed timeline, 60 days to get the IRB and contracts finished, and then another 60 days to your first patient. Mm-hmm. We thought that's a very reasonable goal to try for. And then, so what institutions are motivated to perform early stage clinical research and all that means? Commit to that. And if you commit to that, folks will come to you, obviously. Mm-hmm. So is that. And then on the language issue, it was, we need a master clinical trial agreement, something that industry and institutions can kind of work on together, and Chip was a major part of helping with this with his group, is how do you get to some common language, maybe not every single word, but enough of it drafted so that you're already 80-90% of the way there when you start. And so MDIC has really, been an incredible venue, to work on, that kind of an issue.
Chip, what else did MDIC do in order to expedite this? Rick touched on the clinical side a bit. What were the other things that you can point to very specifically people should be aware of?
Yeah, we really tried to establish a collaborative working environment. So we invited more than 30 leading U.S. institutions, Columbia, Baylor, Mayo, Northwestern, Stanford, very prominent institutions who committed to raising the standard of their performance on early feasibility clinical research. And then we brought together more than 20 sponsors, all the large companies, particularly focused on cardiovascular research, all the ones plus many startups who wanted to work together with FDA on trying to make this better. We had our first best practices workshop. It was 65 people flying into Washington, D.C. from all these different players who spent a day and a half. That was how important it was for so many people to try and work on these problems and restore the clinical trial ecosystem back in the U.S. So a lot of openness and sharing, big companies telling everyone what their secrets were on how they got their studies done, small companies talking about how it was done, clinical sites sharing directly what had gone well, what had gone less well. So creating that kind of safe, collaborative environment and creating the feeling that we're all in this together, that if we don't have a healthy clinical trial ecosystem, none of us are going to be able to progress in this space. And then, as Rick mentioned, the Master Clinical Trial Agreement, one of the members of our group, Jamie Wakowiak from Baylor, a former attorney, brought together 10 major company attorneys together with 12 site attorneys, and they hammered through collaboratively a Master Clinical Trial Agreement that would be a starting point for negotiations. So instead of starting over every negotiation, this far apart, let's get into the middle and just work on the small issues to make this fast and quick, and both sides committed to doing that. So, these are kind of the examples that, of a collaborative working environment that have been really helpful and help streamline this.
I love to hear the big players mixing with the emerging players. I love to hear the processes being really thought out and the tools being put in place. Has there been any performance changes in the studies at all with the data you have in hand right now?
Yeah, we first measured this in 2015 to 2017, and we were just shy of a year on average per site. We remeasured in 2019 and found that we had shaved on average 2 months of time off of the schedule. FDA approval had gone down, IRB review cycles had gone down, first patient enrollment had gone down, but contracting and budgeting still seemed to be an issue and still be taking on average 4 to 5 months. And we've redoubled our efforts on, we did a budgeting best practices workshop, for example, to really try and bring attention to this issue and have both sites and sponsors share how they work through these issues. And we know some of the leading sites are getting startups as fast as 30 or even 60 days. Rick's experience with his leading site of 3 months, that's been shaved to 30 days by the best institutions, and everyone is taking those experiences and applying them going forward.
This is super powerful info. We get to bring the clinical efforts back to the U.S. We give the innovators a better at-bat shot on goal.
That's right.
Right. We get to have the patients really end up being the most important benefactor of this. How come it's still a best kept secret, EFS? It's
a great question. I guess it's one of the reasons why we're here today, right? We were trying to get the secret out. I mean, MDIC has some incredible tools that have been developed, and Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez is the program director there, and she's there to, answer any questions, and you can get in touch with her. Pamela Goldberg has been a personal champion of this effort, as the CEO of MDIC. MDIC has been a great venue to incubate and work on the key issues. But not only that, MDIC has also created a whole series of tools, again, that folks can use, that both small and large companies can use to more effectively execute on an EFS.
Chip, so I'm a startup, I'm an emerging tech company. How do I move this forward? What are the things I should be thinking about? Rick shared some points of contact. We'll make sure we share them on the screen here as follow-up, but what else should we know before we take this out?
Yeah, you go to the MDIC website, all the documents, all the tools are in the public domain. They've been downloaded. You can download the master clinical trial agreement. There's nothing that is not widely available and readily used. Reach out to Liliana. As Rick mentions, she can put you in touch with other companies who've gone through this challenge before and can tell you about their personal pitfalls and how to avoid them. We've got clinical sites that are ready and open and willing to share what works for them. And so there's a real collaborative network, and everyone believes that they can help each other to try and achieve a better outcome for U.S. patients overall.
It's awesome. I love seeing an industry like ours pulled together. I mean, everybody has choices, and I will tell you 99.9% of the people I've talked to over the last 30 years would never think of looking anywhere else, and it's for collaborations like this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Chip. Well said.
Chip, thanks so much for joining us and sharing the great work that MDIC and the EFS program's doing. Rick, same to you. Thanks for coming in studio.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Great.
Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
This is Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.